And now we're up to 1760, when Johnson was 51. In 1760, he wrote an address of the painters to George III on his ascension to the throne of these kingdoms, which no monarch ever ascended with more sincere congratulations from his people. 2 generations of foreign princes had prepared their minds to rejoice in having again a king who gloried in being born a Briton. He also wrote for Mr. Baretti the dedication of his Italian and English dictionary to the Marquis of Abreu, then envoy extraordinary from Spain at the court of Great Britain. Johnson was now either very idle or very busy with his Shakespeare, for I can find no other public composition by him except an introduction to the proceedings of the Committee for Clothing the French Prisoners, one of the many proofs that he was ever awake to the calls of humanity, and also an account which he gave in the Gentleman's Magazine of Mr. Tyler's acute and able vindication of Mary, Queen of Scots. The generosity of Johnson's feelings shines forth in the following sentence, to quote, "It has now been fashionable for near half a century to defame and vilify the house of Stuart, and to exalt and magnify the reign of Elizabeth. The Stuarts have found few apologists, for the dead cannot pay for praise, and who will, without reward, oppose the tide of popularity? Yet there remains still among us, not wholly extinguished, a zeal for truth, a desire of establishing right in opposition to fashion." End quote. In this year, I have not discovered a single private letter written by him to any of his friends. It should seem, however, that he had at this period a floating intention of writing a history of the recent and wonderful success of the British arms in all quarters of the globe. For among his resolutions, or memorandums, September 18th, there is, "Send for books for a history of war." How much is it to be regretted that this intention was not fulfilled? His majestic expression would have carried down to the latest posterity the glorious achievements of his country with the same fervent glow which they produced on the mind at the time. He would have been under no temptation to deviate in any degree from truth, which he held very sacred, or to take a license, which a learned divine told me he once seemed in a conversation jocularly to allow to historians. A later footnote here from a later editor suspects that learned divine is Dr. Archibald MacLean. And now we are quoting Johnson, I believe. "There are," said Johnson, "inexcusable lies and consecrated lies. For instance, we are told that on the arrival of the news of the unfortunate Battle of Fontenoy, every heart beat and every eye was in tears. Now we know that no man eats his dinner the worse, but there should have been all this concern, and to say there was may be reckoning a consecrated lie." End of that passage. This year, Mr. Murphy, having thought himself ill-treated by the Reverend Dr. Franklin, who was one of the writers of the Critical Review, published an indignant vindication in a poetical epistle to Samuel Johnson, A.M., in which he compliments Johnson in a just and elegant manner. I shall now be reading more poetical verse. Oh, joy. And it's going to rhyme. It's a couplets, I believe. "Transcendent genius, whose prolific vein ne'er knew the frigid poet's toil and pain, to whom Apollo opens all his store, and every muse presents her sacred lore. Say, powerful Johnson, whence thy verse is fraught, with so much grace, such energy of thought. Whether thy Juvenal instructs the age, in chaster numbers and new points his rage, or fair Irene sees, alas, too late, her innocence exchanged for a guilty state. Whate'er you write in every golden line, sublimity and elegance combine. Thy nervous phrase impresses every soul, while harmony gives rapture to the whole. And again, towards the conclusion of this epistle, I guess. Thou then, my friend, who seest the dangerous strife, in which some demon bids me plunge my life, to the Aeonian fount direct my feet. Aeonian fount direct my feet. Say where the nine thy lonely musings meet, where warbles do to thy ear the sacred throng, thy moral sense, thy dignity of song. Tell, for you can, by what unerring art you wake to finer feelings every heart. In each bright page some truth important give, and bid to future times thy rambler live. I take the opportunity to relate the manner in which its acquaintance first commenced between Dr. Johnson and Mr. Murphy. During the publication of the Gray's Inn Journal, a periodical paper which was successfully carried on by Mr. Murphy alone, when a very young man, he happened to be in the country with Mr. Foote, and having mentioned that he was obliged to go to London in order to get ready for the press one of the numbers of that journal, Foote said to him, "You need not go on that account. Here is a French magazine, in which you will find a very pretty Oriental tale. Translate that and send it to your printer." Mr. Murphy, having read the tale, was highly pleased with it and followed Foote's advice. When he returned to town, this tale was pointed out to him in the Rambler, from whence it had been translated into the French magazine. Ooh, faux pas. Mr. Murphy then waited upon Johnson to explain this curious incident. His talents, literature, and gentlemanlike manners were soon perceived by Johnson, and a friendship was formed which was never broken. The paper mentioned in the text is number 38 of the second series of the Gray's Inn Journal, published on June 15th, 1754, which is a translation from the French version of Johnson's Rambler number 190. So I guess copyright wasn't such a big to-do back then, or it was different at least. And now I will be reading a letter from Sam Johnson to Bennet Langton, Esquire, at Langton near Spilsby, Lincolnshire. Dear Sir, you that travel about the world have more materials for letters than I who stay at home, and should therefore write with frequency equal to your opportunities. I should be glad to have all England surveyed by you if you would impart your observations and narratives as agreeable as your last. Knowledge is always to be wished to those who can communicate it well. While you have been riding and running and seeing the tombs of the learned and the camps of the valiant, I have only stayed at home and intended to do great things which I have not done. Beau went away to Cheshire and has not yet found his way back. Chambers passed the vacation at Oxford. I am very sincerely solicitous for the preservation of curing Mr. Langton's sight, and am glad that the chirurgeon, which I believe is just surgeon, at Coventry gives him so much hope. Mr. Sharp is of opinion that the tedious maturation of the cataract is a vulgar error, and that it may be removed as soon as it is formed. This notion deserves to be considered. I doubt whether it to be universally true, but if it be true in some cases, and those cases can be distinguished, it may save a long and uncomfortable delay. Of dear Mrs. Langton, you give me no account, which is the less friendly, as you know how highly I think of her, and how much I interest myself in her health. I suppose you told her of my opinion, and likewise suppose it was not followed. However, I still believe it to be right. Let me hear from you again, wherever you are, or whatever you are doing. Whether you wander or sit still, plant trees, or make rustics. Play with your sisters, or much muse alone. And in return I will tell you the success of Sheridan, who at this instant is playing Cato, and has already played Richard twice. He had more company the second than the first night, and will make, I believe, a good figure in the whole, though his faults seem to be very many. Some of natural deficience, and some of laborious affectation. Deficience. He has, I think, no power of assuming either that dignity or elegance which some men, who have little of either in common life, can exhibit on the stage. His voice, when strained, is unpleasing, and when low is not always heard. He seems to think too much of the audience, and turns his face too often to the galleries. He seems to think too much on the audience. However, I wish him well, and among other reasons, because I like his wife. Make haste to write too, dear sir, your most affectionate servant, October 18th, 1760, Sam Johnson. 2 footnotes here. One for when we used the term rustics earlier. It says here, essays with that title, written about this time by Mr. Langton, but not published. So he wrote some essays called The Rustics, but never published them. And about Johnson liking Sheridan's wife, it says, Mrs. Sheridan was author of Memoirs of Miss Sidney Biddulph, a novel of great merit and of some other pieces. See here character post beginning of 1763, page 275. So we haven't got there yet, but she'll be coming back. Isn't that exciting? Now, that was it for 51 for our buddy Johnson. So now we're up to 1761, when he's 52. In 1761, Johnson appeared to have done little. So he's still doing little. This is making me feel great. You know, I don't do jack shit, and this guy's got a whole book about him, and most of these years he's not really doing much. I guess he really starts to shine around whenever Boswell meets him, because it gets more. We get more into the nitty gritty, and pretty soon. I think, maybe not. Anyway. In 1761, Johnson appears to have done little. He was still, no doubt, proceeding in his edition of Shakespeare, but what advances he made in it cannot be ascertained. He certainly was at this time not active, for in his scrupulous examination of himself on Easter Eve, he laments in his too rigorous mode of censuring his own conduct that his life, since the communion of the preceding Easter, had been, quote, dissipated and useless. He, however, contributed this year the preface to Ralt's Dictionary of Trade and Commerce, in which he displays such a clear and comprehensive knowledge of the subject as might lead the reader to think that its author has devoted all his life to it. I asked him whether he knew much of Ralt and of his work. Sir, said Johnson, I never saw the man and never read the book. The booksellers wanted a preface to a dictionary of trade and commerce. I knew very well what such a dictionary should be, and I wrote a preface accordingly. That's pretty good. Ralt, who wrote a great deal for the booksellers, was, as Johnson told me, a singular character. Though not in the least acquainted with him, Johnson used to say, quote, I am just come from Sam. Oh, sorry. Though not at all acquainted with him, Ralt used to say, I have just come from Sam Johnson. End quote. This was a sufficient specimen of his vanity and impudence. But he gave a more eminent proof of it in our sister kingdom, as Dr. Johnson informed me. When Akenside's Pleasures of the Imagination first came out, he did not put his name to the poem. Ralt went over to Dublin, published an edition of it, and put his own name to it. Upon the fame of this, he lived for several months, being entertained at the very best tables as the ingenious Mr. Ralt. I have had inquiry made in Ireland to this story, but do not find it recollected there. I give it on the authority of Dr. Johnson, to which may be added that of the Biographical Dictionary and Biographia Dramatica, in both of which it has stood many years. Mr. Malone observes that the truth probably is, not that an edition was published with Ralt's name in the title page, but that the poem being then anonymous, Ralt acquiesced in it being attributed to him in conversation. Probably, yeah, more likely. Anyway. He had a... I don't know who this he is, these pronouns are confusing. His conversation, indeed, did not discover much on the fire of a poet, I guess Ralt's. But it was recollected that both Addison and Thompson were equally dull till excited by wine. Akenside, having been informed of this imposition, vindicated his right by publishing the poem with its real author's name. Several instances of such literary fraud have been detected. The Reverend Dr. Campbell of St. Andrews wrote an inquiry into the original of Moral Virtue, the manuscript of which he sent to Mr. Innes, a clergyman in England, who was his countryman and acquaintance. Innes published it with his own name to it, and before the imposition was discovered, obtained considerable promotion as a reward of his merit. Alright, I think we're getting off track here, Boswell. Where's Johnson? It's just because he's got nothing going on this year? You gotta... this little, tizzy? Anyway, let's continue. The celebrated Dr. Hugh Blair and his cousin Mr. George Bannatyne, when students in divinity, wrote a poem entitled The Resurrection, copies of which were handed about in manuscript. They were, at length, very much surprised to see a pompous edition of it in folio, dedicated to the Princess Dowager of Wales, by a Dr. Douglas, as his own. Some years ago, a little novel entitled The Man of Feeling was assumed by Mr. Eccles, a young Irish clergyman, who was afterwards drowned near Bath. He had been at the pains to transcribe the whole book, with blottings, interlineations, and corrections, that it might be shown to several people as an original. It was, in truth, the production of Mr. Henry Mackenzie, an attorney to the Executor of Edinburgh, who is the author of several other ingenious pieces. But the belief with regard to Mr. Eccles became so general that it was thought necessary for Messrs. Strahan and Cadell to publish an advertisement in the newspapers contradicting the report and mentioning that they purchased the copyright of Mr. Mackenzie's. I can conceive this kind of fraud to be very easily practiced with successful effrontery. The filiation of a literary performance is difficult of proof. Seldom is there any witness present at its birth. A man, either in confidence or by improper means, obtains possession of a copy of it in manuscript, and boldly publishes it as his own. The true author, in many cases, may not be able to make his title clear. And now we bring back Johnson again. Johnson, indeed, from the peculiar feature of his literary offspring, might bid defiance to any attempt to appropriate them to others. Quote, but Shakespeare's magic could not copied be, within that circle none durst walk but he. Johnson, this year, lent his friendly assistance to correct and improve a pamphlet written by Mr. Gwynn, the architect, entitled Thoughts on the Coronation of George III. Johnson has now, for some years, admitted Mr. Baretti. Johnson had now, for some years, admitted Mr. Baretti to his intimacy, nor did their friendship cease upon their being separated by Baretti's revising revisiting his native country as appears from Johnson's letters to him. Yeah, I wish there were more like paragraph breaks so I could know when's a good time to stop, because I should have stopped after that Shakespeare quote. That would have been enough for today. Anyway, I missed a footnote here. It's about that, I don't know where it is exactly in here. This is about that clergyman that that ripped off somebody. And Boswell says, I have both the books. Innes was the clergyman who brought Samazar to England and was an accomplice in his extraordinary fiction. So it's on the page, so I wrote it. It's not very important. Anyway, that's enough for today. So tomorrow I'll begin with that letter to Baretti. Till next time, bye from Boswell.